Hey everybody, it's Mr. Rogers here, and I would like to talk today about what are species. Species is something that I kind of forgot, not so much that we didn't know, but I just want to make sure we had a very scientific idea in our head because when we've been talking about climate change and extinction, we kind of know that species are things like dog is species or humans, but we didn't have a scientific definition. So I want to make sure we have that down. And I also want to talk about what are important species and how does the hierarchy kind of work. So the first one is what are species? So species are, um, most importantly, they're things that can be able to reproduce with each other and have a viable offspring. And so, um, yeah. This viable offspring means that that offspring has to be able to live, and that offspring has to be able to reproduce. So, for example, one of the most famous examples of this is a mule. So, a mule is a mix between a donkey and a horse that have a child, and a mule is unable to reproduce. It is sterile, and so a mule is not able to be classified as a viable offspring. So therefore, donkeys and horses are different species. They can't make viable offspring, even though they can actually create an offspring. It isn't viable, and so this idea is one of the reasons why we have like you know lions and tigers can have offspring because you probably maybe heard of a liger before. A liger is a dad lion and a mom tiger. But again, another organism that does not have a viable offspring. Most ligers have health issues and they can't reproduce, um, and so therefore they're not viable. The other thing that we kind of add in there, just to kind of throw in there, is that they'll have same behavioral and genetic features. Sometimes species can actually reproduce with each other if they were behaviorally and have similar characteristics. So, for example, a peacock can actually have offspring with some ground hens, which are relatively chickens, but the peacocks don't because they have a different behavioral trait, part of the reproduction process, which is their feathers. So peahens, which they're called, the female peacocks, they will only have children with the best peacock with the best display. And so even though it can have offspring with some other ground chickens, ground hens that are viable for them to actually have offspring with and actually will have viable offspring, they choose not to mate with them because they don't have the appropriate tail. So sometimes it is behavioral and genetic features that separate things as species, not just the viable offspring. But for the most part, if you can reproduce and have viable offspring, you're the same species. If you can't, you're different species. And the other question I wanted to make sure we got to in our notes is how important are different species? Because we're talking about extinctions and climate change, like losing species. Like what does that matter? And every species plays a huge role in the ecosystem. If I remove, say, squirrels from the ecosystem in Kalkaska, that's a big thing. Squirrels play a huge role as a food item for a lot of predators in the area. Also, they take acorns from different trees in the area, oak trees, and they bury them in the winter. And most oak trees actually grow from the fact that squirrels die in the winter or get eaten, and those acorns that they buried will actually therefore become an oak tree. And so this is a common thing. And if we remove squirrels, then these species would suffer. And then if those species suffer, then other species suffer. We're all interconnected in an ecosystem. Now, there are more important species in an ecosystem, and those are called keystone species. And their influence on the environment affects all living things and can even affect non-living things. And so I have a video for you guys to watch about wolves. And wolves are a big keystone species, and some would argue even a huge keystone species in Michigan. And we're starting to implement and bring them back. But we really miss their hunting in this area. But it's not a popular subject. A lot of people don't want wolves to come back to this area. So their influence on the environment, though, is very positive. I at the bottom wrote positive versus negative because there are keystone species that are very negative to a population, especially if they're invasive and they affect the environment in such a way that completely changes it. Or realistically, we're a negative keystone species. Like our ecosystem's environment would probably be better off if we just disappeared from the area. If all humans just left Kalkaska, the environment would improve here. And so we're a negative keystone species. We actually bring down the environment here. And so I wanted to make sure that we were clear on these two ideas. I felt weird because we really didn't talk a lot about them. They're more ecosystem evolution things, and they're going to come down the line. But I felt weird talking about the death of things and also how things get affected by climate change without defining what a species is. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, let me know.